All right, we have student presentations and questions and answers for the whole course, and Anna is, here we go. Anna is leading us off.
If you'd like to
Anna
switch
Gonzalez.
through, you're more than welcome to sit behind the podium. Even if it's just, whatever you're feeling. Just don't shake it around too much because the cord seems to be a little up. You should be good. Here we go. Can I get your keys, Professor?
I'm writing my paper about policy making in Chicago. I'm examining policy on the neighborhood level as well as on the citywide level, with a particular focus on city council, alderman, ward politics, and sort of the intricacies of policy making on the neighborhood level, and different parties that influence those policies. So that's, in short, multi-scalar policy making of revitalization and development in Chicago. So the particular focus of the policy making that I'm going to be focusing on is zoning, revitalization, economic development, sort of on that theme. So this comes from some research that I've done sort of over time on neighborhood heterogeneity and the generations of spatial manifestations of oppression that have come about through neighborhoods in Chicago, and the social and political tensions that inform the policy-making capabilities and outcomes, both on the neighborhood level and on the citywide scale, as well as Chicago's particular strong mayor structure in the political arena, and the political fragmentation, particularly thinking about ward politics, and those sort of intricacies of policymaking in Chicago particularly. There's also a vast literature on city and neighborhood political culture. So I've been reading Furman, Jang, Stone, some of those you've read in class, and then some have been outside of class, detailing the impact of local political structure on the communities and those influences on neighborhood policymaking. So for example, civic organizations and others. So this paper is going to compare those two scales, like I mentioned, with a particular focus on land use and zoning regulations. So on the citywide scale, as I mentioned, the strong mayor structure and mayoral deference, and recently there's been some controversy over mayoral deference and sort of dynamics between aldermen and city council versus strong mayor power, as well as ward inconsistency with community areas and other sort of social delineations of neighborhoods, and sort of the dynamics that causes in city council and political representation on the local political structure. And so I'm going to be looking at the upzoning of 2013, which was a initiative by Rahm Emanuel. So that's one of the sort of initiatives that I plan on looking at. So that's sort of the more citywide scale. On the neighborhood scale, I'm interested in looking at the public-private partnerships and civic organizations. So for example, the New Communities program, and also the sort of establishment machine politics that exists on the, well, one might argue that exists on the neighborhood policy-making scale as well. And then also, throughout both of those, looking at the outcomes of land use and zoning policies in order to sort of illustrate how those policy-making processes go on both scales. So supporting evidence, I'm going to rely a lot on a paper from Bettenker et al., which is in my preliminary bibliography in a further slide. But so that has to do a lot with the argument that establishment politics is rampant on the neighborhood scale as well as on a citywide scale. And basically I'm going to try and contextualize and ground this theory on things we've read in class, like the Elazar and the Stone and the Furman. And then sort of illustrating this through examples of upzoning, like I mentioned, Rahm Emanuel in 2013 and the New Communities program, to illustrate sort of policymaking dynamics and processes through zoning and economic development, and showing their outcomes and how they have succeeded or failed in doing what they were meant to do. And then finally, talking about community-based organizations, bringing in an element from Furman about how grassroots organizations have potential and how they succeed or fail to create policy-making change and influence policy-making. I'm running out of time, so I will skip this slide, but if you are interested, you can read some areas for further exploration that I identified that would be interesting, but likely beyond the scope of what I'm able to accomplish in this 12 to 20 page paper. And so these are things that I might suggest for further research, or that I might allude to, or as I'm writing, might make reference to or bring in some resources for, but that will not be a central focus in my paper. And then I have a preliminary bibliography. As you can see, I have like some readings from class, and then some that are outside of class that I've been reading over the past couple weeks.
Could you just tell us one or two findings? I hear most of the outline and the names, but not what do you what's the story? What's the interesting result?
So I think that what I am interested in showing is the similar sort of establishment machine politics that exist in both neighborhood policymaking and on the citywide scale. And I think that one thing about neighborhood policymaking that I especially want to highlight is the community-based organizations piece that Furman talks about quite a bit in her comparison of Chicago and Pittsburgh, and talking about how, so I read a lot in the Bettenker and All piece about how foundations and civic organizations have had sort of unsuccessful influence in creating initiatives and not necessarily seeing them to fruition on the neighborhood scale, but and as well as, so there's the foundations creating initiatives that are not necessarily seen to fruition or totally successful, and then there are also grassroots organizations or community-based organizations that don't have the resources that they need. And so talking about, I think that one of my primary interests is exploring how that can be bridged when it comes to civic organizations and their influence on policy making.
Okay, so big, challenging, interesting questions, and maybe the theme implicit I hear between the lines is how Chicago is different from Tocqueville and the general American summary which that implies. And you're stressing, it sounds like, more continuity with the machine from the 1930s to present rather than changes after or with Harold Washington Daley to Rahm Emanuel and most of all Laurie Lightfoot, which the press and many commentators are now focused on. So instead, you're really implicitly based on the literature and what you've said briefly, and that's fine. But I would just maybe frame it that way from the start, so people are not looking for Laurie Lightfoot's comments.
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah, I had on the previous slide, which I can't go back to now, but yeah, I had the sort of break with Harold Washington in particular from establishment politics, and how that I would be interested in highlighting that. And I'm not totally done reading all of my work, so this is a 80% outline.
The Dick Simpson book stresses the bits of reform that started in 1900 in the 20th century, through the 20th century, in the 2, 3, 4 wards, especially Hyde Park has always been fighting this. And so Hyde Parkers are more sensitive to your themes, but where and how that is then exploded, and explicitly the alderman said, I'm a reformer, and that went from 4 or 5 to over 25 in the time of Harold Washington's election. I can tell you from interviewing these folks. So people said it had changed, but your implicit point is there's a lot of continuity, and that's fine, and because you can find both. All right, thank you very much for Anna leading us off. Do we have what shall we do? Shall yeah. See, you're ready to put this up, I guess, on the
Tripod, yeah, exactly.
Why don't we then that people want to bring up and see if we have a little or a lot or almost none of these, as it depends on each year. And I'll preface this by saying, reminding you that I gave you something of a review of the whole course in the last session, focused on a new theme, but in doing that, I really talked a little bit about everything else that we had in the course. But so that's the second thing I sometimes do along with this review, sort of saying, what are some of the big themes in the course? And we've heard some of those in different ways, but questions from anybody on any theme. Maybe coming out of your own research, such as the point I made briefly with Anna, that is, how much is there continuity or change, and why have we seen such change, first in Chicago and then nationally and internationally? That was a sort of a corollary theme which we've been talking about several times, very explicitly in the session with Bill Morris. And then after that, the session after Bill Morris, I really talked the whole time about why have we had or not had, and how to, well, we clearly had big changes, but how to, if you're a policymaker, what to do, if you're an analyst, how to advise, interpret the policies which are changing, and how to make sense of all of this. And very smart people all around the world are struggling, and of course this feeds right into what to do under COVID. How to handle COVID is a dramatic litmus test all around the world in that sense. And the ways that the different political systems, international, national, local, are all involved in different ways, and we have lots of local variation. I'll just remind you briefly that Daliana, our top Chicago specialist here in political science, had a one-sentence summary of an analysis he has done on COVID, handling COVID within China. And his quick answer was that the main interpretations is that the main policies implemented within China have been local party officials within different cities within China. And Carrie Wu, who worked on these issues for some time, has published a paper already in the leading Chinese sociological review, measuring citizen responses in the amount of legitimacy which they feel which they report they have. How much do you trust your local officials, your national officials in China, and then he reports names of cities and how much trust there is by name of city. So he has, Shanghai, Beijing, and smaller cities, and there are huge differences within China. So not only do we have different policies locally, we have different degrees of trust documented very powerfully. I was interested that there was confidence in the analysis, the publication, to present that without feeling that this was too politically sensitive. The political sensitivity is a big issue everywhere, including the role of the media. When one talks of the establishment, that implies somebody is creating or fostering or encouraging non-decisions and negative decisions, and where and how thus falls back on the analyst to say where and why can you provide evidence for this. And that's what he has done. The most powerful evidence of legitimacy, which is a citizen-leader relationship, is asking the citizens, and he's published this for China, so something. Okay. Other questions or comments? TAs feel free to ask something, as you've been working on the exam and thinking about these issues, especially thoughtfully. And if you want to fold in anything on the exam or advice or concerns about how the pieces fit together in the course, it would be fine. Yeah, just that's fine, but just loud. Yeah, maybe pull your mask down so you're way. You'll be okay.
And I just had a question. Like I just want to understand. So you have already talked about.
It's slower and louder, half as fast. You just want to ask.
I just want to ask, like, you have talked about the foreign investment, like other investment.
The quality investment.
The foreign investment, the other outside investment, right? In your PDF, so what do you see as the role of international organization and non-profits when you talk about that, and what are the trade-offs?
Wait, slowly. What do I see about the role of non-profits?
International organizations.
Okay.
In terms of investment, and what are the trade-offs that we have to keep in mind when we take the investment from foreign entities and all?
Okay, excellent question. I mean, it's not just one thing, but it cross-cuts a lot of things across the course. And it's also a global kind of question, which means the answers probably are going to vary nationally. The most direct answers are in the book, which the senior author is Megan Kalman, and I'm the junior co-author, and there are two other junior co-authors, one of which is from China and one of which is from Taiwan. So we have, and it was commissioned, that is the first version of this was commissioned by several ministries within China, and they asked us to deal with the role of civic organizations, and so organizations, social organizations. The term nonprofits is not used within China. That's an international and U.S. kind of term. But what we did was to review in chapters on China, Taiwan, Japan, Korea, France, and the U.S. answers basically to this kind of question which you've just asked. And so we have both theories about how nonprofits might and should work. Then we have bits of evidence and surveys from the best sources which are available on this in these countries. And the main story is there are dramatic differences from country to country. If we start just, for example, with what I mentioned with Carrie Wu, trust. How much do the citizens of China trust their government and this is Tocqueville's question. And then rephrasing it within China and within each of those countries. And it's answered in a chapter near the end where we have trust scores for each of the countries. Roughly 50-60% of the Chinese, and this is a standard item from the World Values Survey. The same question was asked of citizens in all these countries. And the Chinese are the highest by far. Something over 50% of the citizens of China say they trust, and so that then is broken down into national government, local government, people in general, police, press, and so forth, political parties, and the like. And I'll just mention in passing, Carrie Wu, who was a key co-author of that section, did his PhD on this topic, and working on it, and he taught me a lot of things as we read stuff together. We found over 50 papers where people asked that question. Some of them inside China, most of them outside China. Many were Chinese working in the Netherlands, working in Canada, and they've left China for good. So the first reaction of the outsiders, especially readers of the American press, would say they had a gun at their heads, and that's why they say there's trust. Implicit, not literally a gun, but people that the authoritarian dominance was so strong, therefore the answers are unreliable. Okay, there is measurement error, but the amazing thing was that the main concern of the authors of these 50 papers was to try to document that, and how strong is it, and where is it, and how can we adjust for it, and so forth. The most dramatic related finding was the people the Chinese who most often say, and the variable which explains why do people show less trust was education. The more highly educated Chinese trust the government and trust the national government and trust less. That's the opposite in all the other countries which we've looked at in general. In the US and Europe, in general, people who are higher in education have trust with themselves, with their friends, with their family, with the police, with the national government. China's the opposite. Okay, so that says something about the power of tradition, the power of Confucianism as a symbolic continuity and respect for the party, for the national government, and for the press and for others. Perhaps. Okay, I mean and that's a strong counter-interpretation to simply the gun at your head. Otherwise, how explain it? And so then one can add, how about Asia versus some of the other countries? And that's why we designed the study that way. So we included France and the US. France having a strong state tradition like China and many of the Asian countries. The US a very weak federalist national system, but a stronger, more active local government. And indeed, we find big differences in many of these respects. And I'll just mention that the civic organizations were, that is, if we look again at your question, what's the role of civic organizations and how does that shift it? I'm answering more with national data because it's available, it's systematic, it's comparable but we don't have the subtlety of individual countries the way that the one paper I started with mentioning does by Carrie Wu and just published. But the big finding, and this feeds into the Chinese distinctiveness, is at the other extreme, France. How much do the French citizens say they trust other people, they trust the local government, trust the national government? About 27%. And it's the lowest. And I put parts of this, I think, on the board, even Monday. I showed it briefly, but it's taken from the third sector. That's the name of our book. When it came out in English, we spent 4 more years revising it, adding more material internationally. So when it was not written, in the first draft it was published in Mandarin. Chinese was written for the Chinese audience first. In English, we wrote for an international audience, not at all specifically the Chinese. So in that sense, why is France so low in trust and China so high becomes a critical, and so we have a bunch of other questions which we then bring in. How much do people trust capitalism? Are you in favor of more of capitalism, or that is, and so you can say substantially ambivalent, really against capitalism. That's where the French stand out. The French are the most anti-capitalist in the world. So I'm mentioning these countries, but other kinds of things. That is, there's a lot of specific distrust of the state. That is, some people support the state because the state is fighting capitalism. And that happened under Mitterrand when he governed with the Communist Party when he came to power in the 70s. They doubled the nationalization, and this rhetoric is still there strongly, as it is with Bernard Sanders in the US. And so this is still an active, and the progressive Democrats still are actively discussing these kinds of issues, challenging the legitimacy of capitalism. The establishment is one label, or the 1%, which came out of the Occupy movements of Wall Street and then spreading internationally. So I'm answering your question broadly, internationally, with some of the factors which we can identify. The best analysis of the French case is by a French professor at the Collège de France who has a detailed analysis of why he mostly compares France with the US. Why are they so different? So he's updating Tocqueville with details on France, and his basic answer is the strong state through the 19th century, or from under Napoleon and then through the revolts back and forth, the complete takeover of power, which happened again and again and again through the 19th century,
less frequently, but still big challenges to legitimacy. When I was a student in Paris, de Gaulle had taken power, and the paratroopers, the generals in Algeria, the Algerian War was still going on. All the generals and all their paratroopers said, "We're gonna invade Paris," or that is, the thought was they were about to invade. They were getting paratroopers ready. They were flying the flight and so forth. So de Gaulle issued a call. Citizens of France, come out and tell those generals you are in favor of political legitimate systems and that you don't support a military takeover. And so thousands of people came to and so I was with 6 friends, and they're really, at the end there, we talked for 5 hours. Should we volunteer? But I've got exams to prepare for, I got to cook dinner tonight, and so forth. And so at the end of all that, we went over. We tried to get uniforms and volunteer and go to the airport. Stand on the runway. Stop. Don't let the paratroopers land. And bottom line was, all the uniforms had been given out, so we couldn't do it in uniform. All right. So I'm just saying, this sense of challenging the legitimacy is what you have in the civic organizations of France. They distrust the government, and this is documented with surveys, with qualitative, with 2 long volumes, or maybe even more than that. Steve Sawyer has translated bits of this from French into. Steve Sawyer is our main collaborator on Seas in France. He worked on this stuff, and it says an English translation, which gives you a flavor of how drastically different this is from China. Okay, so the U.S. is in between. Other countries are sort of in between. In terms of the role, the agenda, the integration, the linkages between the civic organizations and what their agenda should be. And in many, it would be, say, in Chicago, it's much more local. That is, the Chicago, the main civic organizations tend to be neighborhood associations, and the main classification of them, traditionally, which is your focus, is between those that support the machine and so-called independent organizations, which means independent of the party. Okay, so you have an analog of that in France, but the Chicago version in the older days was basically, and this was Jane Byrne's job as co-chairman with Daley of the Democratic Party. Her job under Daley was to show that the independent organizations were illegitimate, irresponsible, corrupt, taking bribes, and she then worked with the machine organizations that were fighting with them, neighborhood by neighborhood, in ways that she spoke to a group of us in Chicago. The beginnings of the Chicago, the new Chicago School of Urbanism. She spoke for over an hour on just this topic when she was running for mayor. So she felt that doing this, that helping the machine destroy the independent organizations, was something she should talk about, and that would help her elect mayor, be elected as mayor in Chicago. I was amazed that she chose the topic, and she talked about it, but she did. Okay, so I'm giving you with these I'm giving you some general answers, Tocqueville on down, but I'm giving you some specifics that illustrate the dramatic differences across these different political systems and how they then vary by neighborhood, with Hyde Park as the biggest exception within Chicago, because it's the opposite of what I said about, that is, what the citywide pattern illustrated by Jane Byrne features. Okay. I could go on, but I'm posing for either elaboration you want. You like that is it's an excellent question, because it in a sense it's what we pursued in the book called Can Tocqueville Karaoke? We took the Tocquevillian analysis and the Bohemian. These are 2 big French theories from Tocqueville and from Balzac, Baudelaire, updated by Jane Jacobs and others, that we have innovation in cities coming out of the artists, and the creativity that you learn as an artist is what ideally will lead to innovation in physics, in law, in creating firms or whatever else. And then say, why does this not work in Asia? Because, and you ask, do you have Bohemians? People in much of Asia will say, what's a Bohemian? No. Do you have this style? No. You look at students dressing, students in the 70s and 80s and 90s in this room would wear jeans and t-shirts. 90% of all the students wear the same, they look sort of the same. I'd go to Seoul, and women had high heels, elegant lipstick. That is no bohemian dress in top universities in Seoul, in contrast to that same period in the U.S. There was no counterculture. That bohemianism implicitly saying that carryover from the counterculture, from the 68 tradition of, don't dress like the establishment. It has changed now. You no longer, that is, students are now dressing on this campus and many others in 1,000 different ways. You're highly individualistic. You don't feel, you can dress any way you want, and there are plenty of people in the same room dressed in many. I'm using it as one simple litmus test. But it's revelatory of ideology and all kinds of other things as well. Okay. Another question from anybody? Or yes?
I apologize. This is not a question about the final. I'm not.
Sure. That's fine. It's fine. Go ahead.
So just for context, I'm using a lot of sources outside the class, including Davis and other sources writing about LA. I am citing books in the class, including obviously Scenescape and Eliezer. Is that all right to have the majority of the sources be from outside this class? They are like academic sources in nature, but they're not articles.
Yeah, you're talking. So you're basing this first on your exam and your presentation on Monday, and so you're applying it now to the writing of the exam itself.
Writing of the essay, yeah.
Yeah, writing of the essay. Yeah, I would say. It sounds as if. I would say what you did on Monday was great. You clearly you've asked excellent probing questions throughout the class. I would say if you answer one half as well in the exam as you've asked questions and talked before so far, you'll have a very, very high grade.
Well, I just meant for the essay itself, because I'm not going to do the final. I'm just going to base my final grade off of the midterm.
So I would, for you, if I try to answer this for other students in general, and that's probably the way we should deal with it, not just you personally. It would be good to have enough citation of other things from the course readings to show that you are familiar with them.
Okay.
Like in the example that I gave in answering this nonprofit civic organization question, I gave you a mix of things that are not in the course readings that we didn't talk about, and I brought them in anew, but I'm also elaborating the classic answers from the course. Tocqueville, why is Tocqueville different? That's a big theme of the whole book on Can Tocqueville Karaoke, and the third sector book, not just Asia versus other countries, but then breaking up the different countries within Asia, contrasting Korea with Japan, with China, and then between Taiwan and mainland China. These have some huge differences, and we talk about them very explicitly with Chinese and Taiwanese co-authors. And I'll just add that Megan Kalman, who was a senior author, was a student in this class. She worked as a research assistant, teaching assistant. She's very, very smart. She worked as executive director of nonprofits and social organizations in sort of radical Bolivia, Latin America, as well as internationally in other countries, in Washington D.C. with international organizations. So she's still doing that. She's a professor at the University of Massachusetts, Boston at the present time, and she's an elected city council member in the town nearby, in a small to medium-sized town. Okay.
so much.
Yes.
Sounds really a
Yeah,
question.
maybe briefly introduce just your name and background to remind us of
Sure.
where you come from.
My name is Zach, and I'm a double major business, economics, and film.
Okay, terrific. Perfect for this course. Question?
It's more of a comment actually that we're talking before with trust in
Sure.
governments.
Sure.
I thought it was interesting we were talking about China and how the more educated the Chinese citizens were, the less trust they would have in the government. It's just kind of an interesting comment to make, given what's happened today with the Women's Tennis Association. For background, there's a Chinese tennis player, a women's tennis player, who was quote unquote like missing, and then came out and spoke, saying, "Hey, I'm okay." But the reality of the situation is that there's a lot of ambiguity surrounding it, and the fact that because of the country where she's from, and the trust in the government is so weak, the tennis association saw that as potentially a cry for help, or in some ways, under false pretenses would be truthful. So I just thought it was interesting the comment about like the trustworthiness of certain governments based off the association of education, because clearly organization as powerful as a women's tennis association would be kind of aware of, I guess, the trust they put in certain governments over others. I don't know, just a comment.
No, I mean, powerful example, right in the press right now, open to various interpretations. I mean, first of all, at a descriptive level, is she crying for help or not, and how? And then second, even if you accept that she is, what are the dynamics behind her view, but then also the views of other citizens and other organizations within China, and then in other countries of the world. So yes, I mean, I wouldn't in any way challenge the distrust which it clearly is generating. And there were many kinds of things, I won't say as dramatic as that in terms of their general coverage, but there are many scandals, you could call them, which led to these often overseas or emigre Chinese working on this topic because they felt that there were things like this going on. And they distrusted somehow this high trust score that people, you say, how much do you have, how much trust do you have? And so there's an implicit distrust leading to a lot of this research in the area. But it's worse in France. At least the French simply say, I don't trust those damn people, neither do the civic organization. So in that respect, we have a lot of organized leaders who are saying what we have among the, let's say, the rhetoric of the progressive Democrats in Washington today has got a lot of anti-establishment, anti-elite, anti-Wall Street, and this was then heightened as well by Donald Trump attacking Hillary Clinton and other Democratic Party candidates attacking Hillary Clinton, which, if nothing else, led to that people saying she's corrupt, she's taking bribes, they're changing, and so her answer. Remember what her answer was? Can anybody show any evidence? And she said, you have said this. People have said this. I've been criticized forgive me, but has anyone shown any evidence that any of my policies have changed because of the Wall Street speeches? And so we had okay. So what I'm not saying it's the same thing, but I'm simply saying these are subtle issues, and if people felt less support for trust is a strong word. Let's say willingness to vote for my Democratic Party candidate. An intermediary solution is not to say I will vote against her, but just not to vote. And that alone was enough to elect Donald Trump, in the sense that that the voter turnout by Democrats went down substantially below what it had been by the previous presidential candidate, Barack Obama. But I'll add quickly, Barack Obama's first election had a huge turnout. His second presidential election wasn't that high. A lot of the most ardent supporters, anti-establishment supporters at the beginning, were disillusioned with Obama after 4 years, and they didn't work, and others did not turn out in the same degree. But with Hillary Clinton, it went down even more. Okay, so what I'm trying to do implicitly in my answer is to say, let's look at the best theories, the best ways of testing them that we have, and let's do it comparatively so we can compare. And the published paper that does this, the only published paper that I've seen which does this directly, is the Carrie Wu paper, where he reports the trust scores for the national government and the local government. The main simple finding, which I did not tell you, I will now, because it's ironic, is that the citizens of China in general have much more trust, roughly twice as much trust in the national government as they do in their local governments. Again, this varies a lot by country and time period. But as I've been to meetings with other Asians, such as especially Koreans, the Koreans were very open, the political scientists, the mayors, the national policy makers, in saying our local governments are highly distrustful, and we need the national government to do most policies, because they will clean up and they will contain the clientelism and the corruption of the local governments. So one big example. Second big example, PhD here, sociology department, by a Chinese emigre who's then worked across the Midway for 30 years. He had a large number of family members working in one small government in China, and so he wrote about them. It's a brilliant PhD, but the main theme of not of the party, that is, the party leader was there's a new party leader who was sent into the village really to try to make things work better and more efficiently. But the local government officials were continually, according to the others in the area, going out and basically hitting up for bribes, which happens in Chicago all the time. I mean, it's a classic often of clientelist political systems. But the point was, what the new party chairman in the town said, no government officials may leave their offices. We don't want you to go out and going to the leading corporations and others in the town and ask them having them take you to a big lunch, paying for all your expenses, and then giving you a bribe. We don't want any of that to go on. And so I'll just add one more point. He then in turn took away all the money which they were subsidizing, all the corporations that govern the town, all the private, if you will, quasi-private everything was government controlled, so I shouldn't say that. There were more open, direct, large subsidies to 20 organizations. He took them all the way from 19 and gave them to 1. And it was a 3-wheel tractor. And it undersold and super outperformed all the other 3-wheel tractors in China. They sold hundreds of thousands of these, and the little town went from being the poorest town in the region to being the most affluent in less than 10 years. So it was a phenomenal success. Choosing one company to do that in this way, it's a highly risky thing, but it worked. But it worked in conjunction. And so what the national government has been doing in the last 10 years in China is they're trying to do something like that. That is, they're commissions of anti-clientelism all over China. Okay, Jake's looking at his watch. I realize we have student presentations. Any one last question anybody wants to add, and then let's do student presentations. Okay, I will step out of the way and listen to student presentations.
Yeah, no questions for me.
But please come up.
Of course, Zach, if you're here if you'd like to present, you're more than welcome. I have your presentation pulled up. I just had to check something very quickly because we're administering an exam at 5:30.
Sure, go ahead.
Sends out. But yeah.
Come on up, Zach.
Sure.
Who else is there after him so you can start to get ready if you want your computer or if you've got them, many of them already on the on your machine, then fine. Okay, so Zach, you don't need your computer. That's fine.
Just give me 1 second, Zach. Okay.
Great title.
Cool. Yeah, you can just tap through with the left and right keys. So if you see it on the screen, it's a PDF. That's your bit.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, so I would say the two things I find most fascinating with Chicago's development over time has been its introduction as being a heavily industrialized global city.
If you're as a speaker, you can take that.
Oh, awesome. So that's the first thing. We really see Chicago come to the forefront of the nation's wealth and what it became the nation's railroad main center railroad hub, following the introduction of Stephen Douglas, who was a senator for Chicago, for Illinois, and eventually implemented several pieces of legislation, including the Illinois Central Railroad Tax Act in 1848, following the heavily controversial Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1854, which he also authored, which actually did have a relationship with the railroad lines, which I get into in the paper. That's the first thing I find interesting about Chicago's history. The second thing is the longevity of the first mayor, Richard Daley, his tenure in office. It's not often that you see a political figure to be as controversial in many ways and be in power for as long as he did. You know, people often forget, but following the riots after Martin Luther King Jr.'s death, he also served another term following that. So he's able to regain power following heavily controversial events. So I said about my paper, seeing there was some kind of relationship between these two aspects in which Chicago is like rapidly urbanized and industrialized, to the fact that there was a centralized figure in Chicago's history with Mayor Daley, and despite all these other factors, was able to rule for so long. So, getting into Stephen Douglas, he's often remembered for being two things: one, a white supremacist who was pro-slavery, and two, his relationship to Abraham Lincoln. He defeated him in the Senate race, but it actually propelled Lincoln to the national forefront as a Republican leader, and he actually lost to Lincoln the race for presidency. So these two different things I want to discuss, also these legislation policies. First thing is the author of the Illinois Central Railroad Tax Act. I go into detail,
Nationally, it was important in having railroads and the state universities get support from the national government, and these were national policies as well as in Illinois. You're featuring that. Go ahead.
There were national policies, but at the same time, the impact it had in Chicago and Illinois was actually very profound.
Yes.
We saw a population increase of over 3 million in about 40 years, which is really unprecedented in our nation's history. I mean, Chicago, 10, 15 years prior, it wasn't even a city, it was a town. So the fact that I was able to grow at such a pace is, it is very interesting. So I go into discussion with different readers on basically, I guess, the outline or the format of the paper is introduction to Stephen Douglas, how he got these legislation passed, why he had them in the first place. I talk about in relation to who governs, how Chicago profits, how Douglas profited. Chicago profits obviously by bringing an incoming flow of traffic and being that center, being that like national railroad hub, city that is located also as a port city, being able to have an inflow of traffic to boost commercial goods and also to increase employment opportunities. Opportunity is obviously an ambiguous term because that implies that labor, people who worked were treated fairly, but obviously there's a lot of grotesque treatment of workers. And then I'm gonna go into how Chicago developed following Douglas, so how Douglas was able to put these legislations, and then how Chicago impacted different aspects of Chicago. So we see that with jobs, we see it with, we see the formation of socioeconomic classes. There was like one of the most profound differences in wealth in Chicago. We see that with like the location of Prairie Avenue. Prairie Avenue was a location where you had these like very, very, very wealthy millionaires living, like George Pullman, among others. And at the same time, there was just like this discrepancy in wealth experience in Chicago. So we really see these different socioeconomic classes. We also see issues with race relations and the fact that the Kansas-Nebraska Act actually allowed for slaves to be able to pass through Illinois and Chicago on its way to Western territories. This is due to the fact that A, popular sovereignty of Kansas-Nebraska, but also B, being the railroad hub that it is, Chicago had just all kinds of trade went on through it, and we see a white supremacist leader actually, who was very unsympathetic to abolitionists, just kind of, I guess, like found a level of racism in Chicago's history. We see again, I discussed like labor and unions and riots. The various riots started. The Haymarket riot happened, and I also want to discuss like poor urban planning. There's a Great Fire in 1871 in Chicago, and the point, about 1/3 of Chicago was burned down, and it was due to the fact that Chicago was, because it was increasing at such a pace in its growth, instead of using more materials that like wouldn't burn or like are able to last longer, they used wood primarily, and the city burned down, tons of people died, and we really don't see a positive way of the city, or like at least a concrete way of the city growing. We also just see violence in every aspect, riots all over, and a lot of casualties involving the building of railroads and treatment of workers. So I'm basically discussing all of these problems in relation to the fact that there's kind of a gross negligence on Stephen Douglas's part. While he sought about making Chicago this premier city, boosting his name to the national forefront so he could set up himself for the race for the presidency, among other things. Also, I want to mention the fact that Stephen Douglas also heavily profited off legislation that he passed. He actually bought up large quantities of land and then resold to companies so he can personally profit, which is obviously like very corrupt. And then the last thing is kind of like, you have all these problems in Chicago society, but like, what happens? Like, what's the fallout of this? So the argument I kind of make here is that the development of the political machine in Chicago is actually like linked to the fact that there was a distrust in the protection of workers, and people felt that they needed the comfort of a centralized power, that they would be actual members slash supporters of, and receive some level of protection. So Mayor Daley comes in after a tumultuous time in Chicago's history with several different political bosses taking hold and then leaving for various reasons. I mean, next to his son, who served actually the longest. I mean, he was the second longest tenured Chicago official.
Yeah, I mean, I also, think it's important to mention, like the idea of like the non-ideological particularism, which was basically the idea that like there was a large support from Irish Catholics for Mayor Daley among people who were also part of the Democrat political machine, and we see him getting elected for all of these reasons over and over and over again, despite his stance on segregation and affirmative action. So I just think that it's interesting to see that we started off with a very like tumultuous time in Chicago with this rapidly industrialized city having a lot of problems, and I feel that actually Mayor Daley is kind of like the symptom of actions that took place with Chicago's founding without the protection to treat workers fairly and to live in a more just society. So I think that's kind of, yeah. That's what
Excellent. No, thank you. Very well put. Comments, questions from anybody here?
I just have one thing to ask here. So when we are talking about Mayor Richard Daley, was it his leadership skills or the policies that he formulated during his tenure that helped him and the city to develop? Like, what do you think? How would you answer that?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I would say it's actually a mix of both. I would say on the one hand, his ability to kind of fill the shoes of that like political machine figure, the political boss figure, allowed him to be elected in the first place. He took over for someone who didn't necessarily do a great job, a series of politicians who just were not looked at necessarily as being like reliable, stable leaders. On the other hand, he was a very strict leader and a strict figure in Chicago, and a lot of people sympathize with that. On top of that, he had some of the best relationships with unions that Chicago's ever seen. Not that necessarily he was a perfect figure for unions, but he was able to work with unions closely and appoint jobs. Again, he was very corrupt in how he treated his government positions. He would like have like these, like people would have to apply for positions, but he'd have like pending exams where the applications would never really go through, and he'd just appoint people to temporary positions, but they would serve there for like years at a time. So he was able to create a very stable forefront, and it allowed just for reliability among his constituents. So yeah, does that answer your question? Or
Yeah, it was more of the leadership skills that he had, like that helped him in the development of the city. Like any of the policies that you know, like on top of your mind, that helped like during his tenure that helped the city in the development front. Any of the policies, any of the major things that he worked on, any
Yeah.
like with the workforce development or with the other development, do you remember any of that stuff?
yeah, I don't necessarily go into his policies per se. I kind of discuss more of like how a political boss was elected for 21 years. But I do mention his relationship with unions, because that's obviously like in essence a kind of a policy, not necessarily like actual legislation, but more like an internal policy, right? I also talk about how he runs his government, it's like how he runs the city of Chicago. I also talk about his relationship with the African American community. So we saw actually with Democrats during the time in Chicago that there was a significant decrease in the black population who actually supported Democratic politicians over time, largely due to the fact that Mayor Daley was a definite racist, B, believed in a segregated society, and C, was against affirmative action. So there's just a lot of, obviously it doesn't help him get elected. It's like it hurts his chances, but he had to make up for it other ways by leaning on his loyal base of supporters, including Irish Catholics, union workers, and more other people.
Okay, great.
Good answers. I won't disagree with anything you've said, but would add the question, and that is, your question and the answers remain highly controversial today. First, at the time, let's say when Daley was at the peak of his power, there were highly contradictory books which came out. The most anti-Daley, or let's say the focus on Daley's, strong boss domination
was a book called Mike Royko with the title Boss, and that was its theme. Versus Milton Rakoff, R-A-K-O-V-E, who published Don't Make No Waves, Don't Back No Losers, which was an insider's, subtitles, Insider's Analysis of the Chicago Political Machine. So he didn't disagree with some of this, but he tried to show specifically how it worked. The third major book was by Edward Banfield on our that is, I mentioned all of these, but the Edward Banfield book basically made a point which most of the others didn't stress, which leads to your question about what were the policies. And that's what's important to link with your question and our brief discussion on China, because authoritative leadership, powerful, strong man leadership, is still very much a hot issue with us today around the world. Donald Trump featuring it most explicitly and saying that Hillary Clinton she doesn't have authority, she doesn't have the guts to really be a strong leader. So that was a totally politically incorrect, feminist kind of statement at the time. So having this introduced into the political rhetoric is totally okay. So if we go back then to your question about Daley, or to Stephen Douglas, and then say the most visible thing which makes Chicago, after the gangsters of the 1920s and 30s, the Al Capone image, the second image post-World War II was Daley. And the most dramatic policy he made was what? How he handled the students and protesters, many students, but not all.
Is shoot to kill?
The 1968 Democratic Party convention. So, you want to mention it? So what did he do in '68?
Was that following MLK's? Right.
Basically, he had we had the national media, all the television coverage, cameras and reporters were here for the Democratic Party primary convention where they were electing, they were choosing the candidate. Protesters came from outside and said, we are not the elected, we're not Democratic Party officials going to the convention, but we want to come in, we want to be able to listen and sit in the back and basically protest. What did Daley do? The police came right in and dragged them away, shouting, screaming, and so forth. And all this was on national television, day after day after day. It was the 1968, the height of the most fundamentally challenging year in American history, and let's say maybe in the 20th century. So immediately there was a survey done, I think it was by the Chicago Tribune, which said, how much do you citizens of Chicago support Daley's position on force? Does the mayor use too much, too little, or about the right amount of force? And what did it show?
Right amount or too little?
Basically, most citizens,
Not enough.
Sorry.
Did people say not enough?
Some said, a chunk of them said not enough, but many of them said either had not enough or about right. That is, it was a small minority that were really against Daley. Okay, that was Chicago.
Yeah.
So people said, then the citizens of Chicago are racist and authoritarian and so forth. So they did many national surveys, and what did they show? The same thing. That is, American citizens in general, and specifically in Chicago at that time, did not want these protesters to be treated in the way that later on our discussion, that is, egalitarianism has changed our lives so much after those years of the '68 that we now have leaders, media, ourselves, citizens, much more responsive to the image that Daley and authoritarianism, in a sense, your theme of choosing these two and putting them together and saying, in a sense, and it's an excellent theme. Implicit as well, we could add Donald Trump, and then treat it nationally and and plus Putin, and then I've supervised MAs which have done this, that have treated Putin and Turkish authoritarianism in these kinds of respects. So clearly, I mean, these are things which you can engage with ideologically, so I hate it, or you can say, let me analyze it and see how it works. And so Putin makes movies, Putin has calendars, he has videos driving a tank with his shirt taken off and so forth. Okay, so he does even more, in more extreme way, the kinds of things which you're focused on, which are great, but I'm just giving these comparative international examples to say, you could go a lot further than the two that we have, as well as China today is a very powerful, important case. Okay, do we have other presenters here for today?
Matt is presenting, and then we have a few folks who are on Zoom.
Okay, well let's do the best we can. Matt?
Yeah, absolutely. Dr. Clark, I apologize as well. I have to leave at the end of class.
Yeah, sorry. Tell us what
I
time.
have to leave at the end of class.
What time?
Scheduled time 5.
Okay.
I think this cup.
Yeah, I saw that. I'm glad you didn't kick it over. I'll toss it.
Yeah, no, it did spill. I didn't kick it, but it did spill. Just you might want to close it, but there's a guy there.
Yeah, it's on the screen somewhere. But that being said, Dr. Clark, I have to leave in 1 minute.
Okay. Maybe we should.
I was going to say, could we perhaps have the folks who didn't present today record something and send it?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. To the folks who are online who didn't get a chance to present, and if you presented and you want to do it again, you're more than welcome to. And actually, we would request that the people who didn't present record their presentations and send it in to us. We'll share that on the Canvas so that you can get your participation credit.
Excellent. Thank you all. Good job, hard work, especially coordination with people around the world and who are not always here. Okay. Thank you, folks.
Just to confirm, like, is there any like box or anything I can email to say like that's just to stay in the final?
Okay.
Register.
Yeah, I misunderstood.
The final table. Sorry, I want to pursue the grading option.
No, I just received it today.
Okay,
From
I just want to know.
his
capability.
Yeah, so that should be.
I didn't want to be.
Oh, the actual presentation. Yeah.
What's
let
wrong
me-
with this guy?
No, thank you for the reminder. Respond to requests for scheduling and then
I appreciate that.
stuff.
It just kind of like the I'm still part of this on the paper, and I just don't feel like you could give it.
Yeah, it's very good.
Whichever the class I don't feel I can give the best attention to.
Reminder.
Like I'm worried about my guys, I want to write a good paper. I just wait. Like I reach out to them.